Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pro Peace Report. I'm Kobe. I'll be the host again today. And so I'm actually really excited about this interview we have today. It's with Alex Suarez. He's an independent journalist, Trotskyist activist. He's going to be an election observer in the upcoming Venezuelan elections next month. And he was one of the people who in 2019 took part in the embassy protection in Washington, D.C., when a group of activists had joined together to protect the embassy from being taken over by the Juan Guaido regime that the United States claims is the rightful government. And so now I'd like to introduce you to Alex Suarez. Alex, how are you doing today?
Very good, comrade. So just in case people can find me on Twitter under Al R. Suarez, but also known as Alex. And I'm pleased to be with you here today.
Perfect. And so I guess before we get into your specific activism and stuff, like tell us about your political outlook, your ideology. I've heard that you're Trotskyist. I did watch a little bit of your debate with what's his name, Caleb Maupin, but
Caleb Maupin, yes.
yeah, a little bit over my head. I don't think I'm as deep into my like actual understanding of the theories behind all of that stuff. But explain a little bit what your perception of Trotskyism is.
Well, Caleb, I found out after the debate, was quite surprised. Not only that the debate was so amicable and there was so much mutual respect and common ground that we found. By the way, this was the day after the infamous, you could say infamous to some people, debate between Vouch and Caleb, right? So Caleb's in my debate only got about 6,000 views. With Vouch, it was probably closer to 600,000. But with his debate with Vouch, Vouch was calling him a Nazi, was attacking him. And when Caleb debated me the next day, it was a completely different encounter. Because, Caleb wasn't too familiar with me. He thought I was an Orthodox Trotskyist. And by no means am I Orthodox. I'm a non-sectarian socialist who happens to be very familiar with Trotskyism. That's how I came to the school of thought of socialism in the early 2000s. And so, with him, I was defending the Bolivarian Revolution, defending, socialist governments. So there are people in sectarian groups that call me a tanky. And then there's full-blown Stalinists that say, oh, he's a trot. And, I just try to follow principles. I don't try to follow like categories, for example, the whole AOC debate, there was some things that people were saying about her that I found unfair, but then there was also the worshipers, right? Just like you, I'm very critical of the AOC worshipers because she has not been, strong enough on Venezuela, clearly. And that pisses me off as a Latino, as a socialist, because she's claiming to be a Latina socialist, but she doesn't come out against anti-imperialism. And so I'm not trying to police one group or another, whatever the category that they claim to be part of. I'm following my principles and what I think is right. So
I kind of go about it the same way. I'd say I try very hard not to be like I'm sectarian in the sense that I have my strong opinion that I'm anti-Democratic Party, right? But I'm not sectarian so far as like if there's somebody in the Democratic Party, a voter who I have an agreement with, I'm willing to talk to that person. I'm willing to talk to anybody who thinks of themselves as being left, whether they are or not, we'll figure that out. We'll talk about it. But like, and I'm not strictly green and I'm not strictly PSL. I'm not strictly CPUSA. Like I like to be agnostic about it. But like, what would you say is like the core difference between your version of Trotskyism and like Caleb's version of Stalinism, just to sum that up a little bit?
Yeah, Caleb denies being a full-blown Stalinist, although since our debate, I don't want people to think that my rupture with Caleb had to do with the debate because we were amicable for several months after the debate. And there was times when I would come on to defend Caleb actually on Twitter. Shortly after that, I was thrown off Facebook unjustly and never was able to return. So I was on Facebook for 10 years. I lost a huge network, but I started to rebuild my network of comrades on Twitter. And on Twitter, at times, voucher people would come on and attack Caleb. And I would say, hey, I'm not like a hardline Stalinist or anything like that, but I think you guys are being unfair. So it didn't have to do with political differences. I would say more personality differences. Caleb was
what's his outlook on Stalinism?
Criticism,
Can you
even
sum
from
it up?
people like me that was being constructively critical of him on some things. And then he just put me in the other group and blocked me. I don't know if he's a full blown Stalinist today. I don't pay attention to what he posts today since he blocked me. But back then he was kind of like in the middle. He was kind of open, and we found some common ground. Like he agreed with me that we need to have a workers' democracy, and that Stalin was not for workers' democracy. Caleb never claimed that Stalin was for workers' democracy, and he agreed with me that the intentions in the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution of Lenin and Trotsky was to make workers' democracy. And so there was bourgeois democracy in countries like Germany, where Rosa Luxemburg and others were trying to start their own revolution in 1919, early 1919, before they were assassinated. This was post 1917 October Revolution. And so they were opposing bourgeois democracy. But one of my favorite quotes from Lenin is when he said, workers' democracy is a million times more democratic than bourgeois democracy. So when you know, Orthodox Trotskyists or Orthodox Marxist professors, you know, academics of the bourgeois claim, you know, that communists were anti-democratic, they're not stressing the difference between Trotskyist communists and Stalinist communists, and they're not acknowledging that people like Lenin were fighting for workers' democracy, which in many ways was more democratic than the limited bourgeois three-class system of voting that they had in Germany. In Germany, really, well, they wanted to have the revolution immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, which, of course, that was crushed by right-wing militias at the behest of the Social Democrats. And then later, of course, we saw the rise of Nazism.
And so I guess in that sense, then Stalinism is more so not workers' democracy, much more like an authoritarian type of structure.
Exactly. It's authoritarian. So Trotskyists are not anarchists either. They have some things in common with anarchists. They still believe in government, but they want a democratic government that's representative of the working class, and not necessarily anti-peasant either. Caleb claims that Trotskyists are anti-peasant. You know, that's why the hammer and sickle was on the Soviet flag. It represented both the workers and the farmers, and a lot of the workers in the cities in Moscow and St. Petersburg, later Leningrad, it was Petrograd at one point too. But a lot of in the urban areas, those workers that emerged into the early 20th century in Russia were formerly farmers, but they were starving. They couldn't, under the Tsar, which was a much worse system. You know, it was an absolute monarchist system. You know, they couldn't get food. Their food was all exported to serve the bourgeoisie in the city. So a lot of them fled the countryside, and they became the working class, entered the factories once industrialization happened. Industrialization, of course, was not as rapid in Russia at the time as it was in Germany. But you know, the Soviets actually, that was one of the good things under Stalin, that his economic policies maintained a socialist-based economy, which would have been the same under Trotsky if he had taken over after Lenin. You know, one of my books is called If Trotsky Won, and I get into the hypotheticals there. But yeah, there was I defend the economic system of Stalin, and I'm not saying Stalin made that system because he wanted to. He had to. Like, he wouldn't have any political support if he didn't make that system. But the thing is, his political system was totalitarian. Lenin's was not. Lenin had temporary emergency measures because there was 14 invading armies. There was a civil war. So there was temporary measures he tried to make. He wanted to reverse them and institute a workers' democracy, but then he died. He died 6 years in power. He wasn't in power that long, Lenin. And so rather than Trotsky take over, which we know from Lenin's testament he wanted, Stalin took over instead and betrayed the revolution. And so there was, again, some things good under Stalin, the economy, the defense of the country from the Nazis, although there was a lot of mistakes up to that. So I'm not going to say Stalin evil. No, there was some good about it. But at the same time, the political legacy of Lenin would have been different under Trotsky. I'm convinced of that.
And I've always because I'm not somebody who was versed in theory, really a lot of this specific theory, until I didn't start researching it until like 2 years ago. So I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of it. But like, you know, the more research I've done into the Soviet Union, how they got women's rights before America, how they got minority rights before America, how they were getting labor rights before America.
3 years before America, the women got the vote in Russia. That's correct. Even
So
before
it's
the end
like,
of World War I, because the Russians were negotiating with the Germans at that point. Of course, this is before the Nazis, to end World War I. And so a year before World War I officially ended, the women got the right to vote in Russia.
I think it's like, and especially the fact that they were like the key player in beating the Nazis in World War II. I think that's like the key point that should.
30 million Soviets were killed by the Nazis, more than any other nation. As a matter of fact, 2 million Soviet Jews were killed by the Nazis. And when you see the figure of 6 million, only 4 million of those were non-Soviet Jews. So there's this anti-Russia hysteria, while at the same time condemning Nazism and the Holocaust. But there were Soviet Jews that were killed by Nazis. That needs to be acknowledged as well. And that the incredible sacrifice of the Russian people Even under Stalin, there has to be acknowledged their sacrifice, because it was only 10% left of Nazis in Europe by the time D-Day came. So when D-Day came, that was the last push to throw out the Nazis from power. But up to D-Day, it was the Soviets that were kicking ass and that were sacrificing themselves in Stalingrad and all those battles.
And that's like the biggest like hole in the propaganda for like the right wing, where they'll say, oh, you Nazis and communists are all the same and stuff. And it's like, once you really look at the history, it's like, no,
I make
very, very
grad
different.
right now here in Jacksonville for history, and those debates come up in class all the time, and it pisses me off. Again, I'm not a fan of Stalin, but to make the equivalence between Stalinists and Nazis, that's wrong. There was a non-aggression pact, which I don't support, but there was a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. That is true, but that's not the same thing as an alliance. Or
no, I heard it was strategic.
With two parties agreeing not to attack each other. And I think the way they did it in selling out the Polish people was wrong. But at the same time, you can't call that an alliance or say that they were ideologically similar. The only way they were similar is they both happen to be kind of, I would say, quasi-totalitarian. Mussolini was also quasi-totalitarian. But their politics were completely different. The fascists emerged as a result of the communist movement in response to it, to attack it. They can't be one and the same. They try to make that equivalency. Some students in the debates in the class, or even some professors, say things like that. It pisses me off because it's not historically and intellectually honest.
People have a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between like political democracy and economic democracy. And I think you see that today with China as well, the way that people talk about that.
China's doing incredible things. Who are we to criticize the Chinese? 18.5 million Americans remain in extreme poverty. China just got rid of 850 million people from extreme poverty. They erased extreme poverty from the country. I believe it's 80% of the world's extreme poor was eliminated by the Chinese government. Who are we to complain about that? Call me anything you want. Yeah. But the reality is that who are we to judge a society with over 1 billion people where everybody has access to healthcare, where everybody has access to education?
Because like our complaints about them are often things that you could just easily apply to us as well. When we criticize their criminal justice system, when we criticize, I don't think America's political democracy is really that good. It's more of an oligarchy, you know what I mean?
Look at the case of Assange. Look at the case of Donziger.
Yeah, I see the picture you got there.
These are guys that, sacrificed themselves for the truth. Whether it was war crimes, whether it was environmental genocide on the indigenous people of Ecuador, and now the corporate state of the United States is persecuting them. And so, who are we to judge how the Chinese handle their judicial system?
Yeah, it's completely hypocritical. And anytime, and it's not whataboutism, I think, to point that out, because it's like, who are we as a country to be telling other countries how they should be doing human rights? I get having a concern, I get voicing a complaint. But when you take it to the point of we need to go to war, we need to overthrow their government, they're so horrible, terrible, the worst. Like, no, like then you're not making sense anymore. Like now you're just antagonizing.
By the way, we never spoke or uttered your name, only written your name. I want to make sure I pronounce it right. Is it Kobe?
Kobe, yeah, like a
okay.
basketball player.
Yeah, like a basketball player. So Comrade Kobe, let me tell you this. Don't tell me I lost my train of thought. That happens to me sometime. It'll come back.
Yeah. No, I know that. We can talk about the next topic. Maybe it'll come back later on. So did you always think this way? Was your political view always socialist from a young age, or was there a point where you had a transition in your life?
Well, I didn't learn about Trotsky until 2006, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was in high school, I started to get acquainted with the anti-Stalinist left. And it wasn't until I met a Cuban in South Florida that he told me to read Revolution Betrayed by Trotsky that really put me into perspective. But I never joined up with any Orthodox Trotsky groups or was critical of socialist governments. I was always sympathetic or a supporter of the Cuban Revolution, later the Venezuelan Revolution. So that's from my teenage years on.
Oh, nice. Yeah, for me, it was like, I started like with electoralism. Like when I was 14, it was like, I knew the two parties were corrupt. I didn't know why the two parties were corrupt. I kind of just knew the war crimes we were doing because the Iraq War was happening. Occupy Wall Street was happening. I had to have been like 11 or 12 at the time. So I had heard these things. So I knew I hated the two-party system. I thought I was a libertarian at that point, just because, I liked what Gary Johnson said about criminal justice
Well,
reform and what he said.
Chomsky calls himself a libertarian. There's different types of libertarians. The libertarians in Europe, I know you're in Europe now, I used to live there. Maybe that's what I was going to tell you, that we have that in common. But, they tend to be of the left. I've interviewed Chomsky back in the day.
Chomsky's like what is he? He's an anarcho-syndicalist, right?
Well, it's also for anarcho-syndicalism. But the exception, really, in some Latin American countries, they have right-wing libertarians that are heavily influenced by U.S. libertarians. But yeah, really the exception of a major country in the world stage is the United States when it comes to right-wing libertarianism, which contradicts the original intentions of libertarianism, which Chomsky's pointed out in the past.
And you said you interviewed Chomsky before.
In 2012, I met him in 2011 during Occupy. And my old podcast, I interviewed him. And then my co-director for a film I had to cancel. I sent him out to Arizona to meet Chomsky because I stay in touch with him all these years. And he was able to interview him with this big Socratic beard. He looks like Socrates, right? Because they called him the American Socrates back when he was clean shaved. Now he really looks like Socrates. Yeah. He's in his 90s and he's still traveling. And even with COVID going on, he's still giving lectures and doing interviews. It's amazing.
I hear he's like a really personable guy too. Like you can just send him an email and he'll like reply to you. Just nobody will just reply.
Well, you meet him, he's like meeting your grandfather. He's very familiar to you. He's very warm and familiar when you meet him. He's very humble, having such an incredible intellectual capacity over the course of decades.
I mean, when he talks about manufacturing consent, I think that was the first time I ever really heard about him. I didn't read the book, but I heard him give talks on it.
You read my article, right? About it. I referenced Chomsky's manufacturing consent, and I wrote an article. Remember in my blog I sent you? It was kind of lengthy, but it was about indoctrination and how they use what's it called? How they use not neutrality. It's another word for neutrality. Objectivity. How they use objectivity in different sections of our society to actually promote selective amnesia and indoctrination of the masses.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole critique I've had before I even heard of Chomsky, because it was like I would see the news go out there and say, we're not partisan. We're just telling you how it is. This is just the objective truth. And I was a journalism student in college at the time. And I'm like,
my undergrad was
ideological. What'd you say?
My undergrad studies was in journalism. Yeah.
Oh, nice. So we do have that in common. But so now tell me a little bit more about your activism. When did you start getting into activism? Was it around the time of Occupy Wall Street? Was it before? What have you done?
My first major protest was 10 years prior to Occupy. And you see, I don't think I sent it to you. I wrote a brief article recently, and it's called 10 Years On, The Bittersweet Legacy of Occupy. And on that article, I touch about my first protest, which was against the war in Afghanistan. This was in October of 2001. And from then on, even when I lived abroad in South America or in Europe, in Spain, including in Peru, and my father's Peruvian, I always joined up with protests when I could. I joined anti-fascist protests in Spain. I joined protests in solidarity with teachers on strike in Peru. And so wherever I found myself, I would take part in activism. And by the time I returned to the United States in 2010, 2011 happened and Occupy started. Actually, I returned to the United States in late 2009 from Europe. I lived there for 3 years. And so from 2010, 2011 through Facebook and other outlets, I was able to make contact with very important activists to help start Occupy DC and, Occupy in general, people like Kevin Zees, like Medea Benjamin. And later I would run into them in 2019. They're probably the reason why I went to protect the Venezuelan Embassy in DC. And so through my connections I made with the Venezuelan government, through the actions, I was approved to be one of the international observers in the regional elections that's coming up next month. So it's very exciting.
So talk a little bit more about the embassy protection. So at the time, it was the U.S. government claims the election was fraudulent. They said the opposition in Venezuela boycotted the election. They had claimed that the 2017 Constituent Assembly was not fair. Talk about what the opposition's claims are and how it led to this embassy protection and what the protection was like.
Anyways, I think if anybody Googles the major players, and I wasn't a major player, I was just another activist helping out at the embassy. But if they Google a lot of the major players, like the late comrade Kevin Zees, Medea Benjamin, and others, they'll see probably some references to Revolutionary Alliance. So that was a group that I started, early 2018 in South Florida. and we're non-sectarian. So people basically that left moving for the People's Party, they didn't like Nick Brown's leadership. People left the Green Party, left the Socialist Party, whatever. They in South Florida, these groups of people that I met in different meetings when I used to associate with those groups, we all had Revolutionary Alliance, and so I heard about Code Pink and Popular Resistance and all these major groups that were going to DC to converge on the embassy. I said, okay, well, I'm one of the co-founders of Revolutionary Alliance. I'm going to go on my own. I didn't really get the support I needed, but luckily I had enough funds and I flew up there between classes. And this was in May 2019. By the way, I want to mention before I forget, because we were talking about Assange. This actually is related too. It is related.
Okay.
So, I went to Miami a couple months ago and got to meet Assange's father and brother.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so I was originally going to go in June to the International Congress that they had in Caracas in Venezuela. I had to cancel last moment, but we were going to make a resolution in solidarity with Assange. We might try to do something like that during the elections when I'm down there for the next trip.
And so would that be groups in Venezuela, or would that be the government?
What's that?
Would that be groups in Venezuela or the government of Venezuela speaking out about Assange? What's that? What would happen there?
We wanted the International Congress, hosted by the Chavista government, by Maduro's government, to make a declaration of solidarity with Assange. In the last moment, things got complicated. We couldn't, but that's something we're going to look at later on. What was I going to say about Assange?
South Florida.
So he was stuck at the Ecuadorian embassy. And so they went in April, literally the month before we started the protection of the Venezuelan embassy. In April of 2019, Lenin Moreno sold out his country to the IMF, and in exchange for the IMF loans, let the British.
I don't know if can you hear me, Alex? I don't know if I lost you or not. I don't know if it's frozen. I don't know if he's talking, if it's just me talking. We'll give it a second.
I'm back.
You're back.
I'm back.
Okay, perfect. We can hear you again.
Okay, yeah, I think the Wi-Fi just went out for a sec. There was a rainstorm outside. Anyways, what I was saying is that in complete violation of the Vienna Convention, the British authorities went in and grabbed Assange. And he's been in Belmarsh prison, which they call the Guantanamo of the UK ever since. And so it's interesting because Kevin Z's passed away in September last year, and literally he was a huge Assange supporter as a civil rights lawyer. But literally the last article he wrote the night before he died, and he was never able to complete, was an article about Assange, because Assange's hearing was coming up. Yeah, and so I suggested to his domestic partner, Dr. Margaret Flowers, that she finish the article for him. They haven't done it yet, but that would be great if Popular Resistance could finish the article for Kevin about Assange. But yeah, so there's connection between people that were supporting Assange the month prior and the people that were at the Venezuelan embassy. Also, there's connection between people that started Occupy, like Kevin Z, Occupy DC in October of 2011, who was one of the major players there inside the embassy, one of the last four that was forced out. And he was there at the behest of his own organization, Popular Resistance, which is still in function, primarily by the contributions of Dr. Flowers and the people that are working there. I wrote for them in the past about Che Guevara in late 2019, about Bolivia and his legacy.
I loved Kevin and Margaret Flowers. They were some of the first people in the Green Party who I had heard about. I think it was back in 2016 I first heard about them. I voted for Margaret Flowers for Senate, I think it was when she ran. Yeah, so it was sad when Kevin died. I mean, I didn't know him that well. I think I might have seen him in person once. I don't remember, but
we met in person in 2011 in DC on several occasions. As we first met each other, then we met each other in the forums and all that. But we had been in touch on social media since 2010. It was really a crushing blow. He was somebody that was really supportive of my film. Had he lived longer, I might have not had to cancel the film, honestly. But there'll be other opportunities. Other people might want to do a film about it that I could help from behind the scenes or as a producer or whatnot, because I do have a lot of material. But I think this is a part of
tell the audience, what is your documentary that you were filming? What's it about? Why did it fall apart?
It fell apart for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons it fell apart, and you're familiar with this, is the left eat ourselves, don't we? A left cannibalism. That's a big problem. And I've always stated the reason why the right is so much more united than us is because they're not as intelligent. When you're intelligent, you question things. You don't just take the orders of the leadership and that's it. So what I want to learn from the Venezuelan revolution when I go down next month for the first time is how they were able to unite and get power. I want to learn from Latin America and other countries that did this so we could apply it here at the U.S. empire, because the U.S. empire having a revolution, that would have international implications that we can begin to imagine. That would change the world. Absolutely.
I mean, that's why I'm like so looking forward to the day where we're not the global hegemon anymore, just because once we're no longer the global hegemon, we'll be off the world's neck. We won't have our boot on their neck anymore because we won't have the power to. And then we'll have to shift our focus to all the things that are happening inside the country that we've been entirely ignoring. Because once we're no longer the superpower, you're not really aiming to be a superpower anymore. You're kind of declining into the normal, into the middle of the pack. And all these countries who are in the middle of the pack below us, not the developing countries, but, developed countries that are not as economically powerful as us, they have better human rights conditions for their people.
What does China do in Africa? What does China do in the developing countries? They send vaccines. They do business. They don't invade. They don't topple governments. So again, who are we to judge how they operate internationally? We're the empire here. I'm against all empires, but if the Chinese got their dominance in the world stage, that means they'd be doing more business and sending more vaccines. That doesn't mean they would be invading and toppling countries or doing economic warfare. That's one of the things I want to tell you, Kobe. Economic warfare is largely ignored. They're called sanctions. They sound like a surgical procedure, right? Oh, just a sanction, no big deal. No, it's economic warfare. They say in Spanish, la guerra económica. So the economic warfare has killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans from lack of access to medicines. And this even members of the moderate opposition in Venezuela has acknowledged. Chomsky has also spoken on it. He went to Venezuela once. So this economic warfare that's continued against Cuba, against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, Iran, by Biden is identical to Trump, actually worse, if you want to look at facts, because Biden actually increased the sanctions against Cuba, made it even worse than Trump during those CIA-backed protests. You know what I'm talking about. And also DeSantis here in Florida, he passed a law saying it's legal to run over protesters. They recently reversed that in the courts. They reversed in the courts post right-wing Cuban protests. So the right-wing Cubans came to Jacksonville and throughout the state, and they blocked traffic, and none of them got arrested or ran over. Why is that? Because as long as you're a right-wing protester, right? As long as you're a protester saying, no mask, or your protester saying bomb Cuba, continue to sanction Cuba, then Governor DeSantis will turn a blind eye. But if you're on the left, then they're going to come and they're going to jail you like they've been jailing my comrades in Manatee County and Tallahassee with Extinction Rebellion. This is what they do.
And the sanctions, that's a really big thing that I've noticed. That's like the huge blind spot on some of the progressive Democrats, people who like the progressives. They have no understanding at all of the harm of economic sanctions. And, I've even, because I'm in my human rights master's degree program now, and even hearing how people in the human rights field talk about sanctions as like, it's not good what happens to those people that get sanctioned, but it's meant to, convince the government to change, and it's meant to pressure them. And I'm always just like, no, like in Venezuela, 75%, they used to, 75% of their oil revenue used to go to social programs and stuff.
And also they exported oil to help the Haitian economy, to help the Cuban economy. They were helping their brother nations, and so they had international implications. These oil sanctions and other sanctions on the Venezuelan people, and also from 1961 to the end of 2014, the United States had a very strong economic embargo against Cuba, and all they ever did was make the Castros stronger and the people weaker. So it doesn't work. They know it doesn't work, but they still continue to do it. And under international law, it's actually a form of warfare. So when you say economic warfare, it's quite literal under international law when they do these unilateral, completely illegal sanctions or embargoes against these nations.
I mean, it just makes no sense, because it's like, so to convince their government to stop committing human rights abuses, we are going to commit our own human rights abuses on your people so that they get so angry at your government and blame it on the government instead of the United States that we think that they're going to overthrow them. And then what ends up happening is that the government in the country that we put it on, the government goes, look at those imperialist.
They can blame all the problems on the sanctions, and 9 times out of 10, they're right. So they'll tell their people this. Does that mean their people are going to topple them? No, that means the people are going to back them and be pissed off at the external threat.
Exactly. And I saw something the other day, the NICA Act that's in Congress now. It's co-sponsored by like 4 Democrats and Marco Rubio.
One of them, at least, is from, the Republican I know is one of the masterminds is Marco Rubio. He's from Florida, and that guy is a complete liar. In his book, he said his family fled Castro. It's not true. His family fled Batista. I mean, this guy is a complete fraud. And to one group, he's saying, "Oh, I'm not a Trump Republican," and to another group, he says, "I'm with Trump." I mean, he's just playing games, you know.
What was so frustrating about that bill is like, it's 4 of 5 of the co-sponsors are Democrats. One of them is my Senator Ben Cardin in Maryland. And when I watched the video, I don't remember what group it was. It was some group in Baltimore that's like has a partnership with this town in Nicaragua. But they were talking about how they read off the list of all of the people that those sanctions were going to apply to. And it's like, the major political party, the families of the major political parties, the military.
You know,
the
they
police,
even did
half the country.
They even did a sanction against the wife of Maduro. She has no political position in the government. They're going after people's family members. I mean, this is Nazi-like how they're using these sanctions.
So tell us about Alex Saab. So I don't know.
How do you know about him?
Story
I was the first to tell
a little bit.
I was the first to tell Assange's family about Alex Saab. That's a fact.
Really?
You can go and see the video of Assange's brother. John Shipton's the father. The brother is I call him Mr. Shipton. I don't remember his first name. Do you remember his first name?
Gabe. Yeah, I met him both.
Yeah, that's right. Right, Gabriel. And actually, one of Assange's sons named after the uncle, Gabriel, too. So Gabriel, I met a Gabriel Shipton and John Shipton, gentlemen, great guys. And there's an interview. The very first city they went to, the United States, where I was in Miami. Then shortly after, they went to Vermont, Boston, D.C. So when they were in D.C., Anya Parampil, the wife of Max Blumenthal, she interviewed Gabriel, and she referenced Alex Saab. But when I went up to John and Gabriel in Miami and asked if they heard of Alex Saab, they said no. But over the course of their traveling, they kept hearing about him, and Gabriel had the integrity to mention that, because it does take a little bit of attention off the brother, off the son, but it's all related. Just like the corporate prosecution of I mentioned earlier, Donziger. All that's very similar. You could draw parallels with Alex Saab, with Assange. And okay, so let me get into Alex Saab. So Alex Saab was born in Colombia, but he's a Venezuelan citizen. And of course, the Colombian regime, which is just a puppy of the United States, has done nothing to advocate for him, much like the Australian regime for Assange. But, he is a Venezuelan citizen. So he grew up in Venezuela. He happened to be born in Colombia, next door. And so he was sent as an official diplomat. So again, this is a violation of international law. He was sent to an island off the coast of Africa, Cape Verde, to help facilitate bringing food to Venezuela as a diplomat. And then this court in Miami, never providing to this day, a couple of years later, any evidence, made false claims of drug trafficking or whatever it was. And so now they're holding him as a political prisoner, and he's dying. He's literally dying. He has cancer. They're not permitting him to get his cancer medications. They say that a CIA agent goes in his cell every night and beats him and tries to have him, give dirt on Maduro or whatever dirt that doesn't exist. So they try to coerce him, just like they coerced Chelsea Manning and tortured her when it came to Assange. So you can imagine what they're doing to Alex Saab, who's not a U.S. citizen. This man is being tortured. He's not getting access to the medicine they need. He can die at any time. It's very urgent what's going on with Alex Saab. So just like Assange, he's a victim of the U.S. international terrorism against diplomats, against whistleblowers, against facilitators of whistleblowers and journalists like Assange. It's just an ongoing terror campaign,
I mean, the human rights hypocrisy of the United States, like once you really dig into the depth of it, I mean, it's shocking. I just read yesterday about how, what's it called? The International Criminal Court. There was a Hague Invasion Act passed in the U.S. in 2002, where if any U.S. personnel are put in the Hague for human rights abuses, we have the right to invade the Netherlands and free them from the Human Rights Court. And it's when was
the last time a country invaded the Netherlands? Nazi Germany. So the United States is like, we're the new Nazis in town. The Nuremberg principles, the Hague principles, the ICC, we don't have to sign it. We don't have to apply to us, but we'll preach it to the world. We'll be a hypocritical state. You know what Malcolm X said about that. He wanted to bring the United States to the United Nations. He said, we don't live in a democracy. We live in hypocrisy. And as long as we have the two-party dictatorship, we're going to continue to be an oligarchy of the elites and not a democracy of the people or the working class.
It's just so crazy because when I talk to people in my human rights classes about it, they totally agree. My professor today told me how crazy it was that the U.S. did that, and nobody took it that seriously. They didn't think the U.S. would actually do it, but like is just out of left field. And I would talk about all these hypocrisies of the United States when it came to human rights.
By the way, the
and
ICC
they'd all agree, but there's no enforcement.
One white man. They always go after dark-skinned African dictators, right? The ICC, in its entire history, post-World War II, has only ever gone after one white man, because when the Nazis were going after, that was before The Hague. That was in Nuremberg. And that one white man was Milosevic, right, over the destruction of Yugoslavia. And I'm not saying Milosevic was a good guy, but I'm just saying that's an example of how they only focus on African leaders. And Milosevic was never sentenced. They had processed him, they brought him to The Hague, and then he died of a heart attack. So
didn't the U.S. supported the prosecution
that were tried, that were sentenced, were dark-skinned people. And also, I want to draw parallels to Assange here. So back when WikiLeaks was first emerging, they were successfully exposing African dictators, many of them backed by the West, that were selling out their people. And a lot of the institutions in the West were applauding WikiLeaks. They said, "This is great. You're exposing these third world, African dictators." As soon as they turned their scope on the West and the war crimes that they were perpetuating, then all of a sudden Assange was turned into a pariah, was pariahized, or whatever you want to call it in the Western press.
Well, I remember the same thing happened with liberals and conservatives going back and forth on it, when it was like, when he released the Iraq war documents. Now, the establishment always hated Assange. Both wings of the establishment always hated him. But democratic people, like the public, the voters, the democratic base, they were anti-Iraq war. They tended to like he was revealing those things. Then 2016 happened, and he revealed all of the DNC corruption. And all of a sudden, it's like the parties like flipped, or like the population, the ideologies flipped, where it's all of a sudden liberals hated Assange.
That's what partisanship or tribalism is. Every 4 years, the Democrats turn to the pro-war party, and the Republicans are the pro-peace. Another 4 years happens, and then the Republicans are pro-war and the Democrats are pro-peace, because they're not following principles.
So what do you think the path to a socialist revolution in America is? I mean, I know it's not in the two-party system, but what do you think is necessary for us to do to get to that point?
The thing is, our society is different than Germany. There's a lot of parallels. The Nazi party actually got a minority of the working class vote. Most of the working class in Germany, because Hitler was elected, voted for the Social Democrats. So unfortunately, in this society, we have the working class so more indoctrinated than they were in Germany, which is very scary. And of course, the working class is within a few years, in the current path, is going to become the majority, because the middle class are losing their homes. If you own a home, you're middle class, pretty much. The middle class are losing their homes every day to this crisis. You know that. And so the working class is emerging. But the problem is, much of the working class votes against their own interests over racial or class issues. Well, really against their own class, because the majority of the working class in this country vote Republican. And that's very scary, because I'm not a fan of the Democrats or Republicans. But that means in a few years, if we continue on the current path and the Democrats continue to demoralize the left, what's going to happen? There's going to be a populist even worse than Trump. And I call them fake populists, the right-wing populists. I'm a populist. If you're a populist, you're a socialist. But the point I'm trying to make is, there could be somebody even worse than Trump as a result, because you have so many working class people that are indoctrinated. So I say educate the working class. Try to reverse that. You have to focus on educating the working class, and that's how you can build consciousness toward a revolutionary scenario.
Well, I think one of the big barriers to that for a lot of people is because Trump supporters have such fascistic views, because they have so much racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all these things. A lot of the times, I don't think we're necessarily persuading them as much as we are berating them and and attacking them, because justifiably attacking them. But
look, I tell Christians, this is what I tell Christians, Kobe. I've actually changed some Christians' mind and made them go on the left course. And I'll tell you how. There was a Peruvian priest named Father Gutierrez. He invented liberation theology in the 1960s. So the current Pope, he comes from that school of liberation theology. He's a progressive Catholic. There was a progressive Catholic government in Paraguay. They united with Chavez at one point. And so I tell them, read liberation theology. It's been translated to English, because that takes parts in the Bible, like Jesus throwing out the money lenders, and show how Jesus really would have been called a socialist. And also I tell them, the Republican Party for decades was actually pro-choice. They were against government intervention into the personal lives of women. That's a fact. All of a sudden, in the 1970s, they thought, here's a way to win. Let's pretend that we're pro-life so that we can get the Christian vote. So therefore, no government intervention internally, except when it comes to women's fetuses, just so they could get votes. They don't care. So I tell them, I said, because that guy said, I hate Trump, but I voted for him because he's pro-life. I'm like, do you think if Trump impregnated one of his lovers, that he would immediately have her sent in one of his limos?
He would totally get an abortion, 100%.
They don't give a crap about that. No. So if you put it that way and educate them, I think you can get some of the more not fully indoctrinated Christians to come to your side as well.
I mean, I've had luck in my life, and it doesn't always happen right away, right? It's not something that necessarily happens in one conversation. But a lot of times I've met people who are right-wing, and at first they have the reaction of, oh, you're a communist, socialist. You know, at first there's the initial, like, they completely don't like my views. But as we talk more and they notice, oh, I'm not, because they perceive communists and socialists to be Democrats, right? They think neoliberals are communists and socialists.
Yeah, they think that Pelosi,
but like genuinely.
AOC is not even a real socialist. How are you going to say Pelosi is?
And so once they see us call out the Democrats for the justifiable reasons that we can all call them out for, then they start to realize that there is a distinction between neoliberals and socialists and communists. And once they realize and it takes time, it's like a process. But once you point out the hypocrisy of Trump, they'd be like, oh, he's anti-war. Well, he's dropped more drones than Obama, so he's not anti-war. He dropped the mother of all bombs, biggest non-nuclear bomb.
He did less people than Obama in his first term. That's a fact. So when people said that Trump was really rhetoric about, I mean, of course, the way he went about deporting was more brutal than Obama. Obama had minimal caging of children. So yes, he was the first president that caged children, but Trump completely expanded that program. But at the same time, if you look at the scope, DACA and those other programs that protected immigrants, that was in Obama's second term. So in Obama's first term, actually, he deported, I don't remember the figures, but I looked it up. Obama actually deported more people than Trump did in his first term.
Well, and now in Biden's, only 10 months of his first term, I've heard he's deporting at a much quicker rate than even Trump was.
Well, look at the Haitian immigrants. Look at the Haitian immigrants on the border. They're sending these cowboys, to whip them. And they said, oh, we're going to make sure that they can't use whips anymore. So what are they going to replace it with? Batons? That's what bourgeois reform is. That's what bourgeois reform is I'm going to hit you a different way so it doesn't look as bad. That's what it is. And do you know what Malcolm X said about progress? It's one of my favorite quotes. I'm going to paraphrase. He said that when you put a knife in somebody's back and you stick it out 3 inches, that's not progress. Progress is taking the knife out and starting to heal the wound. So, to say that there's progress in reform in this corrupt system is a joke. And things in some ways are even worse than it was in the 60s under Malcolm X because, the Supreme Court, they say we're in a post-racial society. Give me a break. The Supreme Court reversed voting rights acts, the things that Dr. King was fighting for. So in some ways, we're in the same or even worse situation as them because at least then the media wasn't saying we're post-racial.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is that the Democrats tend to be more socially progressive. They use the identity politics language. They make it seem like they're treating minorities better and treating LGBTQ people better. And so they use that, they cloak themselves in that to hide the fact that their economic policies are still just as racist as ever. They're not different at all. The imperialism is like racism on a global scale. I mean, that's like as racist as you can literally get. But just because they say it nicer, people don't realize it. And it's like so crazy. I think people are going to start to realize it after. I'm worried actually about what's going to happen after Biden's presidency, because if he ends up deporting more immigrants than Trump did, if he ends up doing more sanctions than Trump did, and his approval rating is going to be just as low, I mean, people are going to look at it and go, well, Trump wasn't as bad as even Biden, so maybe we need Trump again. And it's like, no, like if Biden doesn't fix that, let me tell you something.
That's Kamala Harris got how many delegates in the primaries? 0. Tulsi Gabbard got more than her. Tulsi Gabbard got like 3 delegates, and she kept in the fight longer than Kamala. But I'm glad that she exposed Kamala in the debate. But regardless, actually it's ironic, right? Because when she was exposing her, she was kind of defending Biden there. But let's not get into Tulsi. My point is that Kamala is so unpopular. She had to quit the race early on. She got 0 delegates. So if Biden dies or quits, like Kamala, are you kidding me? Kamala against Trump 2.0 or against Trump literally? I mean, she's got no chance. It might have to be like in 68 when they brought Democrats to stand up to Johnson. By the way, your camera's kind of frozen. Are you there? I waited out until he's back on. He might have had the same issue I had where his Wi-Fi went out. Are you there?
I'm back now. My laptop died. I'm back.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, what I was saying is we might have either another Republican, a Trump 2.0, or Trump himself. If he goes against Kamala, she doesn't have a chance in hell. She is so unpopular. Even her father calls her a liar. I mean, she's just, there's no way.
Mm. So like, and that's what scares me about the Democratic Party's path going forward is it's like, they have Kamala as a front runner. They have Buttigieg as a front runner. They
Yeah.
have Biden as a front runner. Like, if you look at the polls, those are like the people who are at the top. AOC is the only person who's slightly left who could compete with them. And it's like, but even AOC is not.
Well,
She's losing her.
are you familiar with all with Florida politics? I know you were in Maryland.
Not so much, a little bit, but not so much.
So there's a woman. I've met her a few times. She's semi-progressive, you could say. Her name's Nikki Fried. She's the thorn in the side of DeSantis' cabinet. She's the only Democrat in his cabinet. I'd say she's left to center. She's not a full-blown progressive. I'd say she's semi-progressive. She's running for governor. It's her and Governor Christ, who was the former Republican governor of Florida, who switched sides, and DeSantis. Those are three candidates we have. But we're so far to the right in the battleground state of Florida that's all we have. And you know, for example, a conservative in, I don't know, you're in Sweden, right?
Yeah.
So probably a Swedish conservative politician or a conservative politician, you know, they're to the left of most Democrats in the United States because our standards are so far to the right. It's terrible.
Also, so it's crazy. Like when I think about that, because like the Swedish Democrats are the Swedish far right, and I don't know everything about all of their policies, but you know, they're not trying to get rid of the welfare state entirely, right? They're not trying to get rid of universal health care. They're not trying to, maybe they are trying to chip away at those things, but they're not getting rid of
support because the people love universal health care in every country that it's been applied to, no?
Yes.
Including in the third world. In the Bahamas, they have universal health care. I found that out recently a couple years ago when I traveled there. In Cuba, in Jamaica, in Venezuela. So in countries that are developing, they don't have a lot of money, they're able to do it. What are the two excuses that the bought-off politicians always give us about not being able to have Medicare for all, universal health care? Number one, our population is too big. Number two, we don't have the money. China has it. You know, it's like
that totally blows it out of the water. And it's like, it's crazy because in Sweden, like, and in Europe in general, it seems the political culture is just different in the sense that, like, yeah, they have the far right being super racist. They have the far left calling them racist. They have that same general dynamic, but they feel, I think I get a sense that somebody feels like one party represents them, right? Or at least they feel they have options. They can actually have a dialogue. They in America, we have this type of discourse where it's like you kind of just scream at the other side and hate everybody on the other side, whether it's Democrat or Republican, or for us, we hate them both equally. But like they have a tendency to actually talk and have a dialogue and things kind of churn because it's not two opposites, right? It's not two clashing. It's 5, it's 7, it's 8 clashing.
Hey, let me ask you: is there anybody asking anything in the chat on YouTube?
No.
Not yet.
No, we got 5 people, but nobody's talking.
Okay, feel free to ask me anything you want. I'm very open. But I wanted to make a point about Venezuela, about their system, because I've studied their system for a long time, and of course, I'm going to see it firsthand next month. So, are you aware that when you vote in Venezuela, they give you a receipt showing how you voted?
Oh wow. I didn't.
Yeah, there's an automatic audit of the vote. So there doesn't have to be a dispute. They reach an agreement with the opposition where the government automatically audits all its voting system a certain percentage, higher than any other country. I don't remember what the exact percentage is, but you had organizations dedicated to international supervision or observation of elections, like Jimmy Carter's himself, who said no other country in the world. He said if only the United States could have a democratic system as democratic as Venezuela, no other country in the world. And so literally, you have receipts. I mean, in this country, in our capitalist system, you buy a 5-cent piece of candy and you're entitled to a receipt. But your vote, you don't see it, and they can manipulate it. And through electronic or the destruction of paper ballots. As part of Canova's campaign in 2018. They clearly destroyed his ballot. The Washington Schultz Mafia went after him. I was there during that. So this is what they do. So who are we to judge when they, in many ways, have a more democratic system down there? And I'll be happy to report to you when I return to Venezuela firsthand, because they're not just going to send me to Caracas. I'm trying to organize going to Valencia as well, which is the third largest city in Venezuela. It's also not every region is under control of the Chavista government, but Valencia is, so I will be safe there. I have comrades there. So yeah, I would love to observe elections in different parts of the country and report back to you.
So what in general, so explain the constituent assembly thing, because I thought that was such an interesting concept. And I know the opposition claimed it was undemocratic, whatever it is, but like it
No,
seems
no,
more
no. This is the
democratic to
irony.
me. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that. This is the irony of ironies, comrade. So the Constituent Assembly was under majority opposition control. That was one of the few sections of the Venezuelan government where they won elections fair and square. That's later been reversed because the people were so disgusted with how they wanted their country invaded and how they were pro-sanctions, which the overall majority of Venezuelans opposed. So then later there was elections again, and then now the Chavistas have the majority again. But at that time, when Guaido temporarily was head of the Constituent Assembly, because they changed different parties, his party is very small, the Voluntad Popular, which is ironic too, because you know what that means? Popular will. They had very little popular will in the Popular Will Party. But anyways, of course, Guaido stepped down later. Now they're still calling him president, even though he never ran. It would be like grabbing Pelosi and saying, well, I don't like how the Trump-Clinton election went. So, now Pelosi said
it'd be like China.
The less people knew who Guaido
deciding
was.
Pelosi should be president.
Nobody knew who Guaido was until Trump announced that he's the president now. That's the insanity that we came into going to the Venezuelan embassy. But yes, they were under opposition control. So the opposition were saying, we won in the assembly and we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And it's a dictatorship. Excuse me. This is what I told the exiles to their face at the Venezuelan embassy in Spanish and in English. I told them, I said, how could you call it a dictatorship if your party won in the Constituent Assembly? This is how full of contradictions they are.
I mean, and then they boycotted the next election. So they didn't even.
No. They boycotted the presidential elections, comrade.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, after they won that one. After they won that first
the Constituent Assembly because they were regional elections, but they did not. They did boycott. Most of the opposition parties boycotted the presidential elections. There was a couple of opposition that ran, but they lost legitimately to Maduro. Maduro got 60% of the vote in the last one. So.
That's what I'm saying. Is how could they say it's a rigged election? If they won the election right before it regionally, right?
Yes.
So they claim that one was free and fair. They do claim the 2015 election was free and fair.
When they win, it is. Yeah.
But then nothing changed between. I know there were people who were arrested for corruption charges, right? Is that one of the things that they say that the Maduro regime arrested people?
Every single time a police officer, and again, if some idiot sectarian is going to tell you, police in Venezuela, just like the United States, they're full of crap. Because the police in Venezuela are mostly of the working class, and they're defending the government of the working class. So it's not the same situation. It's not the police that are slave catcher or descendants of slave catchers that representing the elite and the people with big property. The police of Venezuela is the opposite. But there's been individual cases where police were too rough.
Cases, right?
Let me explain. So there's been individual cases where police were too rough with I don't want to call them protesters. These were rioters. They were killing people. They were lynching dark-skinned Venezuelans that they assumed were Chavistas. Okay, so we're talking about racist, upper-class, white Venezuelan minority in Caracas. So those rioters, yes, some of the police were too rough with them. And what did Maduro do? He pressured the authorities to arrest those police officers as well. And not only that, whenever anybody's infiltrated the United Socialist Party, which is the party of the Chavistas, and has been an opportunist or taking part in corruption, Maduro sent them to pressured the authorities to send them to prison. And they've done that. A lot of them escaped and went to Miami and were protected. And they say, "Oh, whistleblower of the Maduro government." They're not a whistleblower. They're a person who's wanted in Venezuela for corruption.
It's just so crazy, like the regime change efforts. We did direct coup attempts. There was at least 2 coup attempts, I think.
The first time the head of state was targeted with a drone was Maduro. It's a miracle he survived that.
I saw the video.
Yeah, there was several soldiers around Maduro that were bloodied. I think a couple of them died. They literally in the middle of a military ceremony, just like how they took out Sadat, they sent a drone to kill him and he still survived. So that's amazing. But yes, that was probably one of the most dramatic, but there's been several coup attempts.
I mean, I remember the one where
they captured Americans. They captured American mercenaries.
Yeah, I was going to say that one. Yeah,
that was so.
That was like a cutout.
Because the head guy that was part of it, who actually here in Florida, the Melbourne is where his headquarters are. Of the mercenary group, he went to Colombia and he revealed the whole operation because he was pissed because Guaido didn't pay him, and he showed the recording where Guaido said, "Yes, you're going to go and kill Maduro. You're going to do this, you're going to do that." And guess what happened to Guaido? Nothing, because Maduro's smart. He knows that if he puts Guaido and he lets him walk the streets freely because he knows if he puts Guaido in jail, he's going to make him a martyr. Even though we all know he was behind the coup attempt against Maduro multiple times.
I remember he interviewed
a guy who tried to take you out and hire foreigners to take you out. The same mercenary group that went into Haiti, by the way, and took out their president. So Maduro's letting Guaido walk the streets, and it's actually smart. At first, I was critical. I was like, "What is Maduro doing?" Put him on the lock and key. This guy's a traitor. But then I understood because Guaido's lost all support. He can't show his face anywhere in Venezuela having rocks thrown at him. He's considered a traitor. And this is the guy that Biden is still saying is president of Venezuela. Give me a break.
And even AOC, I know she follows him on Twitter. I know she's taken pictures with him and people in his staff and stuff.
I didn't know she took pictures with him. I heard she took pictures with the staff of Áñez of Bolivia.
Yeah, Jennifer Áñez. That must be the one I'm thinking of, yeah. But and she defers to Democratic leadership on the issue. She doesn't even take a stance.
Well, who was the journalist? I know him. He was with me at the embassy. Who was the journalist that asked AOC about Venezuela? Max Blumenthal. Yeah. So he did a great thing because he caught her off guard. He didn't schedule it. She was walking out of her office and he just completely caught her off guard. She said something that was pretty stupid, right? Because Pelosi was one of the Democrats who stood up to applaud Guaido at the State of the Union. And this was after he had to step down from the assembly because his own party got another guy to replace him. Even his own partisans hate him. So it's just ridiculous. He's the puppet that wants to invade his own nation, that wants to support sanctions. And Biden needs to reconsider all these things, because so far he's keeping the same identical Trump sanctions against Venezuela, and he's increased sanctions against Cuba, which is terrible. Cuba's not getting the oil they needed for Venezuela, and yet they're still inventing vaccines, and China's still sending vaccines to Venezuela and other countries. I have a comrade in the Valencia region of Venezuela who recently, him and his parents got vaccinated because of China. So when China is being criticized as like the new empire, I point to that. I say, no, they're saving people's lives. They're sending vaccines. So it pisses me off. And a lot of it, let's be honest here, Kobe, is racism. They can't see yellow or brown or dark leaders rising up. They can't. It's this white bourgeois mentality.
It's one last thing to drive the point home about Guaido. I remember when John Bolton was Secretary of State, and one of the things he had said explicitly, just out loud, was, we want U.S. oil companies to be able to go in and, profit off of the Venezuelan oil. We don't like that it's nationalized by the Venezuelan people. And what was one of the things that Guaido said he believed in? Letting private interests come in to use the oil instead of for just the Venezuelan people. And so can you talk about that? And just in general, because it's not just Venezuela that does things like that. Cuba has nationalized healthcare. It's talk about countries that when they try to, nationalize a resource for themselves, and just the consequences that come from that from the U.S. as a reaction.
Yeah, so under Obama, there was accusations of trying to bring back the Monroe Doctrine, which of course he negated. He always denied that. But here we have Bolton and Pompeo and others openly advocating for a return of the Monroe Doctrine. I couldn't believe it. I said, wow, this is pretty non-hypocritical of Trump's officials. They're actually admitting that they want to bring back the infamous Monroe Doctrine. But when it comes to the price of oil, part of the reason why it's gone up, Kobe, is because of our sanctions against Venezuela. If we would do business with Venezuela, which Maduro is more than willing to do, our oil prices will go down. So it's affecting the working class here at home, this continued economic warfare. And also, it's very hard to get into Venezuela and to Cuba, even to this day. And that I had established very strong connections with the Venezuelan government to be invited, as I told you. But it's not easy. And guess what? That violates our rights. So Americans that don't care about third world or people of color, fine. But think of it as our rights. This is how I convince people. We're not the policemen of the world. And this affects our freedom of movement. This affects our rights. This affects our economy negatively. The Iranian government is more than willing to do business with us as well. So they might not sell out their people and make their oil price a little bit higher than a puppet would. But still, the moment that we do business again with Iran and Venezuela, our oil prices will start to go down. It would tremendously help the working class in many parts of this country because we don't have public transportation that's successful like in China, where they have a train that goes as fast as a plane. I mean, we don't invest in infrastructure like in Europe and Asia. That's just a fact. And so you have working class people that rely on their cars to go to their job. Their prices of gas will go down dramatically if we start doing business with these countries again. But no, we're obsessed with getting puppets in there, and it's affecting people on both sides. More of them, to be honest. The sanctions are killing people that can't get cancer medications.
That's what I was saying. It would help
of terrorism, of warfare.
It would help the people in those countries if we were just doing trade with them. We'd be lifting people out of poverty, for one.
Trade, not aid. Let me tell you something, Kobe. Trade, not aid, because I'm insulted what Bernie did. You know that. Bernie said, we're going to give a little bit of aid to Gaza, but I'll go ahead and vote for the billion. At least AOC abstained, because what Bernie did was worse, because he said, okay, we're going to make this little deal, and then I'm going to vote for $1 billion for the Iron Dome that they don't even need. And, what was the analogy I gave about that? It's like giving a serial killer a gun and saying, well, it's okay. We gave him the gun, but we're going to compensate the families, the survivors, after he kills them. It's just
knowing that
insanity.
they're going to die. And so to me, it's like,
you have the AOC Bernie worshippers. I can't stand them. AOC Bernie do some good. I'm not going to say they do all wrong. But you have the people that they can do no wrong crowd, and it's like, give me a break, man. He just voted for $1 billion. I mean, the Zionist regime, the terrorism they're doing the people of Gaza and Palestine. I mean, it's well documented for so long. I mean, there's something got to be done about it,
Man, it's crazy because the $1 billion for the Iron Dome is in no way equivalent to the $1 billion in humanitarian aid, because the Palestinians still don't have an Iron Dome. You know what I mean? It'd be one thing, and I still think just no funding to the Israeli military at this point. I think at this point we just need to cut off the military funding. But if you were going to do a deal like that, if Bernie was going to do a deal, why not make it the deal be, I'll only support it if you build an entire Iron Dome for the Palestinians?
I say that we do trade with Palestine, with both Hamas and Palestinian Authority. We do trade with them and maybe help them build an airport in Gaza. That would be something serious that would help the Palestinian people. But just throwing aid at them, who knows how they're going to get it. It's just ridiculous.
And so any last words, Alex, before we leave here today? I know it's 8 o'clock. I have something I have to do too. So any last words?
Yeah, please reach out to me on Twitter. I'm trying to maintain a following there. I was censored about a year ago from Facebook, so it's hard to build a following. But yeah, if people want to know more, firsthand from me, what's really going on in Venezuela, join me on Twitter. That's where I post the most. Suarez 2, I think, with the app for the Twitter, and I'll continue to be in touch with Kobe and other comrades. So
great, and so we'll definitely have to have you back on after the Venezuelan election, especially if there's disputes and all sorts of disagreements over it. But I think you'll have an interesting perspective to tell us afterwards. Thank you so much, Alex. It was nice to meet you.
Yeah, because I'm fluent in Spanish and I've maintained contacts down there, so I'm going to see things that probably a lot of those observers can't see, and I'm going to be fully transparent. So more than happy to tell you about it. You'll be one of the first I talk to.
Perfect. Looking forward to it. See you later. Have a good one.
All right, comrade.
And so that was the third interview for the Pro Peace Report, talking to Alex Suarez. Again, he's an independent journalist, activist. He helped protect the Venezuelan Embassy from the regime change attempt that the U.S. was doing with Juan Guaido. And he's going to be an international election observer in Venezuela for their elections next month. And so just one last thing, as I do every time nowadays, support my work. Nobody has it. It's okay. I don't really expect to get any money out of this. It's not about the money. I do it because I like to learn from people and teach other people what people are saying. But if you can help, my Cash App is ProPeace97, and 50% of any money I get, I will be giving to mutual aid, whether it be Rome's Tour for the Poor, whether it be the DC Freedom Fighters, who I protested with, and I know they do good work. They, them collective in DC, I know they do good work. So if you donate to my Cash App, I will be giving half of that. If I get any money by the end of the month, I'll let you all know what I end up doing with it. But thank you so much for watching the Pro Peace Report. Can't have peace until we have justice.